We are back, and we are joined now by Joanna Wuest. Apologies for mispronouncing it a little bit earlier. Assistant Professor of Politics at Mount Holyoke College, incoming Assistant Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Stony Brook University, author of Born This Way: Science, Citizenship, and Inequality in the American LGBTQ plus Movement. And Joanna has a piece in the spring 2024 issue of New Labor Forum entitled The Best Way to Secure LGBTQ Rights, Unions. Joanna, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So happy Pride. And we were just headlining this earlier in the show, how unionization and the rates of workers voting to join unions is the highest that it's been in at least 15 years, according to Axios. But also, I would say, just the level of enthusiasm surrounding unionization is extremely high. But can you talk a little bit about when your scholarship in studying the history of unions as they relate to LGBTQ people and what this moment is like within that broader history?
Certainly. So yeah, we see tons of exciting work being done by a new generation of labor militants. Particularly Starbucks Workers United features a lot of kind of queer advocacy blended into their union building at those cafes. But if we look back several decades ago, we see a history that I think a lot of folks don't know about how central labor unions in this country have been to LGBTQ rights. So as early as the 1980s, we're really seeing some important contract wins being won by newly organized queer caucuses within unions. An early example would be workers unionized in working for the Village Voice, won domestic partners benefits, which was really crucial during the beginnings of the HIV/AIDS crisis. And we've just seen in the last few decades those contract wins build up, so much so that you might be a unionized worker who has sorts of protections against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity as part of your union contract in a way that maybe your city or state laws don't actually protect you from such discrimination.
And your piece highlights this well because teachers are often at the front lines of many anti-LGBTQ laws throughout the country, and it's not just DeSantis in Florida with Don't Say Gay. Recently, you write about an example from California as well in the late 70s and early 80s, where there were conservative-led efforts by politicians to crack down on LGBTQ teachers in schools. The groomer trope goes back many, many decades, if not centuries. Can you talk a little bit about that example from California?
Yeah, so right. Don't Say Gay is in a long line of decades and decades of this kind of scapegoating of queer teachers. And so we see in 1978, as the religious right is starting to organize in this country, this state senator named John Briggs in California, who is notably part of the Reagan coalition in California at the time. He's an ardently anti-labor state senator, and he decides that he wants to put a ballot initiative up to the voters in an attempt to strip gay and lesbian school teachers of their ability to teach in public schools. And thankfully, this set off a massive reaction, just not among gay and lesbian civil rights organizations themselves, but there was a huge workers' coalition of different unions involving postal workers, the United Auto Workers, teachers' unions especially, but even culinary workers all got together and decided that they needed to defeat what they saw as fundamentally an attack on a minority group that was en route to a broader destruction of public goods, like public education, like the ability of workers who work for the government to gain protections and to make a living wage in that line of work.
And it's important, particularly, I think, for groups on the front lines like LGBTQ people, like people of color, to have these protections because we see in just statistics, how levels of poverty for LGBTQ people in particular are higher compared to cis straight people, which on its face, LGBTQ people come in all different colors and different ethnicities, right? Like the systemic issues that LGBTQ people face are different than that of non-white people in this country. But at the same time, you can just see it in the numbers. They are still on the front lines of discrimination. And without a union, it's just kind of like every man, woman, or person for themselves.
Yeah, this is really important, especially because not only do unions protect all sorts of, give all sorts of protections against discrimination that, like I mentioned, some cities and states don't afford sexual and gender minorities, but unions also contribute to living wages, housing security, healthcare access, and all of those things are actually at the root of a lot of health and economic disparities in the LGBTQ population writ large. So again, unions protect against discrimination on the job, but they also provide the kind of benefits to queer workers that they provide to all workers that can actually kind of ameliorate those sort of ugly disparities in the LGBTQ population.
The Supreme Court and conservative activists really want to give places of work and businesses the ability to discriminate against LGBTQ people based on dubious claims of religious freedom. Can you speak about that fight in recent years and how unions have played a role in standing up to those efforts by conservative lawmakers and lawyers and activist groups?
Yeah, so part of the way that unions do this is just by providing protections that civil rights law cannot. And by that, I mean that your Civil Rights Act at the federal level, for instance, has this thing called Title VII that protects you on the job against discrimination. And those protections granted on the basis of race and sex have been really paltry. And that is, if you're a worker who's discriminated, you bring a Title VII claim to the federal courts, and it's extremely difficult to win your case. Much more difficult than it would be to win a case on the level of your union kind of fighting against a violation of the contract if you have anti-discrimination principles kind of baked in there. And this is becoming even more important as we see the Supreme Court doing this really disingenuous competing rights kind of framework. And that is, they pit the newly won civil rights of sexual and gender minorities. The Supreme Court granted some Title VII protections to those groups in 2020 in a case called Bostock. But who knows how much that's actually going to matter in the near future, because the Supreme Court keeps giving, as you note, employers a religious and a free speech constitutional right to discriminate against their LGBTQ workers. And if we had to guess about who's going to win out in that duel of civil rights, I think it's pretty clear with this Supreme Court as it's constituted who that's going to be.
And as always with these fights, it's people who are either lower income or middle income even, who are the ones who bear the brunt of that. What are some of the recent fights that you're seeing on this front in terms of targeting LGBTQ workers? Yeah,
so for one, we see, I think most famously, the sorts of rollbacks of rights and attack on queer people in the state of Florida, as kind of spearheaded by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. And so we know kind of laws like Don't Say Gay have restricted the ability of teachers to even talk about pronouns, about LGBTQ history in the classroom. And those laws are passed on this kind of presumption that school teachers are potentially groomers, right? And that they're a danger fundamentally to children. And what's so insidious about that is that at the same time the DeSantis coalition passes something like Don't Say Gay, they also passed a thing called the Paycheck Protection Act in Florida, which targeted those very teachers that they just scapegoated as dangerous pedophilic groomers by attacking the kind of fundamental basis of their unions. And so we can see it's a classic scapegoating move. Do I think DeSantis likes queer and trans people? No. But do I think that that's his main aim in government is to attack queer people? I don't think that's the case. I think
it's a pretext to attack public education, basically.
Exactly. It's exactly what it is.
Right. And it's just, I don't really care what happens to them along the way, and I'll throw some red meat to our base that's obsessed with social control. But in the end, it's about attacking education and teachers more broadly.
Exactly. And we can see why that's the case because in the last several years before 2021, Republican governors were really terrified to pass anti-trans laws. And that's because back in 2016 in North Carolina, this governor lost billions of dollars in tourist and economic development in the state because he signed a draconian anti-trans bathroom law. And so these state governors will pick up this scapegoating legislation when it works for them. In the rare moments that business opposes that sort of thing, they'll drop it. And so we can see they don't drop the attacks on unions, though. So that's the kind of steady through line in their coalition.
You mentioned businesses there, and you see just so much pinkwashing. I'm not sure if that's is that the best term for that? I've been mostly talking about it in regards to Israel lately, but basically using the veneer of LGBTQ tolerance and acceptance in order to sell things. But then when it comes to, say, protecting someone like Dylan Mulvaney, who was viciously attacked by the right in a coordinated campaign against Bud Light, they kind of capitulated. And I know that that's not about unions, really, but it does just go to show that corporations are not going to protect people proactively. It's really whenever it's in the interests of their shareholders and how much money they can make.
Totally. Yes. The labor unions we've been talking about make kind of steady gains for LGBTQ civil rights, whereas these business coalitions and corporations really selectively put up pride decorations and even engage in some really limited boycotts in these very kind of rare moments. And they do so not even just to sell to a queer clientele, but like in that North Carolina example I was discussing, many of the companies that pulled out economic expansion in reaction to that bathroom ban actually did so because they could get a lower tax rate, more kind of tax holidays and all sorts of benefits to locate to another Republican Party controlled state next door. And that might explain why when North Carolina goes it alone with a bathroom ban in 2016, we see all of this economic boycott and pulling out of business expansions. But when all these Republican-controlled states do it at once, these corporations don't have states to go to any longer as a credible threat where they want to relocate, where there are kind of lower protections for workers and fewer taxes for them to pay in general.
You also wrote about the Starbucks unionization push and the role that LGBTQ people have played there. We've had Starbucks workers on this program to talk about their efforts, and we know that the Starbucks unionization effort was one of the big moments, I think, for labor in this country in quite a while. How do LGBTQ protections play into the Starbucks example in particular, and what were some of the roles that queer people, gay people, trans people, etc., played in that fight with Starbucks?
Yeah,
or playing currently. Sorry.
Right. It is, yes, ongoing. And so, a little while ago, I believe last summer, the director at Pride at Work, which is the kind of queer advocacy arm of the AFL-CIO, said that Starbucks Workers United was the queerest union that he'd seen in ages and kind of maybe ever. And I think that has something to do with the demographic. It has something to do with the kind of issues that are on the table for those workers. I believe also last summer, Starbucks Workers United protested the company's decision to pull some of Pride decorations that they had historically put up during the month of June. Unsurprising in light of the fact that There are many kind of states, as we've talked about, that have gone hard against trans civil rights, and that's become so much of an issue that it might affect their consumer base. And of course, they're not going to put their neck out if that is the case. And so I think those are just kind of some of the examples of what Starbucks Workers United have done to kind of further queer rights in this country and for the workers on the job.
Well, Joanna Wuest, you can read this piece in Jacobin as well as New Labor Forum entitled The Best Way to Secure LGBTQ Rights Unions. You can also read her book, Born This Way, Science, Citizenship, and Inequality in the American LGBTQ Plus Movement. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.